They called her the ghost wife, quiet, obedient, and completely invisible in her husband's glittering world of high finance. Charles Weaver thought he held all the cards. He had the multi-million-dollar company, the shark lawyers, and the young mistress waiting in the wings. He thought divorcing Julia would be as easy as signing a check. He thought she was nobody. But Charles made one fatal mistake. He never looked at her birth certificate. He didn't know that the woman he was discarding wasn't just a housewife. She was the heir to a dynasty that could buy and sell him before breakfast. And when her family finally stepped into the courtroom, Charles realized he hadn't just filed for divorce. He had declared war on the wrong people. The sound of the pen scratching against the paper was the only noise in the expansive, glass-walled office of Weaver Technologies. Outside, the Seattle skyline was grey and weeping rain, a stark contrast to the sterile, climate-controlled perfection of the room. Charles Weaver sat behind his mahogany desk, a piece of furniture that cost more than most people's cars. He didn't look up as he slid the document across the polished surface. "It's a generous offer, Julia," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the warmth it had held 10 years ago, when he was a struggling coder, and she was the girl who made him coffee. "Better than what a judge would give you, considering the prenup." Julia sat in the low leather chair opposite him. She was 32 but looked older today. She wore a simple beige cardigan and dark slacks, her brown hair pulled back in a practical, uninspiring bun. She looked exactly like what she was, the woman Charles had outgrown. She picked up the document. Her hands didn't tremble. That annoyed Charles. He wanted tears. He wanted begging. He wanted her to ask him how he could throw away a decade of marriage so he could list the reasons. Because you're boring. Because you wear beige. Because I am a CEO now, and you are still just you. "The condo in Belltown is yours," Charles continued, checking his Rolex. He had a lunch reservation at Canlis with Audrey at 1:08 p.m. And I'm authorizing a lump sum payment of $200,000. Alimony set at $5,000 a month for 3 years. That's plenty for you to figure out whatever it is you're going to do next. Julia read the numbers. They were insulting. Charles's net worth was estimated at $40 million. He had just closed a Series B funding round that put his company valuation in the stratosphere. 200,000 was pocket change. "Charles," Julia said softly. Her voice was calm, which Charles mistook for resignation. "We have been married for 10 years. I worked 2 jobs to pay the rent while you coded the prototype for the Weaver platform. I paid for the servers. I paid for the patent filings." Charles waved a hand dismissively. "Ancient history. I built this company. My genius. My late nights. You were just there. Look, don't make this ugly, Julia. You know my lawyer is Garrick Sloan. If we go to trial, Sloan will destroy you. He'll argue that you contributed nothing to the business value, which is true. You'll end up with legal fees that will bankrupt you, and you'll get 0. This is a mercy offer." "Mercy." Julia looked up at him. Her eyes were a strange shade of grey, usually soft, but today they looked like steel under murky water. "Is this because of Audrey?" Charles didn't even flinch. "This is because we are in different stratospheres, Julia. I need a partner who understands my world. Audrey has an MBA from Wharton. She manages my PR. She fits the image. You manage the grocery list." He leaned forward, his tone dropping to a patronizing whisper. "Take the deal. Sign the papers. Walk away with some dignity." Julia placed the papers back on the desk. She didn't sign. "I need time to review this with legal counsel," she said. Charles laughed, a sharp barking sound. "Legal counsel? Julia, you don't have a lawyer. You don't have the money for a lawyer who can stand in the same room as Garrick Sloane. But fine, take the weekend. But the offer drops by 10 grand every day you wait. He spun his chair around to face the window, dismissing her. Close the door on your way out. Julia stood up. She didn't slam the door. She closed it with a soft click. As she walked through the sleek, modern corridors of the company she had helped fund with her waitressing tips, employees looked through her. To them, she was already a ghost. She walked past the reception desk where Audrey sat, blonde, 24, and glowing in a red designer dress. "Bye, Mrs. Weaver," Audrey chirped, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. She knew. Everyone knew. "Goodbye, Audrey," Julia said. Julia walked out into the Seattle rain. She didn't open an umbrella. She walked 3 blocks to a small, nondescript coffee shop, sat in the back corner, and pulled out her phone. It was an old model, cracked screen. Charles hated it. She dialed a number she hadn't called in 12 years. The phone rang once, twice. "Kensington Residence," a stiff British voice answered. "Alfred," Julia said, her voice finally breaking, the tremor she had hidden from Charles leaking out. "It's Madeline." There was a profound silence on the other end, a silence heavy with a decade of absence. "Miss Madeline?" The butler's voice softened, losing its professional edge. "My word, it has been a very long time." "I know, Alfred. Is my grandmother there?" "The matriarch is in the solarium, as always. Shall I inform her you are on the line?" "No, Julia," Madeline said, wiping rain from her cheek. "Tell her I'm coming home. And tell her I need the family council. I'm going to war." The divorce proceedings began 3 weeks later, not in a private mediation room, as Charles had hoped, but in the Superior Court of King County. Charles was annoyed. He wanted this over and done with so he could announce his engagement to Audrey in Forbes. He sat at the defendant's table, looking impeccable in a bespoke Italian suit. Next to him sat Garrick Sloane, a man known in legal circles as the Butcher. Sloane was bald, terrifyingly fit, and had a smile that reminded people of a shark sensing blood. "She's late," Sloane muttered, checking his watch. "And she hasn't filed a response to the motion for summary judgment. This will be over by lunch, Charles." "Good," Charles grunted. "She's probably trying to find a parking spot for her Honda." The courtroom doors opened. Julia walked in. But she didn't look like the Julia of 3 weeks ago. The beige cardigan was gone. She was wearing a black tailored suit that fit her frame perfectly, though Charles noted it looked unbranded. Her hair was still in a bun, but it was sleeker. She walked with a straight back, her chin high. She was alone. Charles scoffed audibly. "She's representing herself. God, this is pathetic." "Order." Judge Halloway banged the gavel. He was a tired-looking man who had seen too many divorces and just wanted to get to his golf game. Case number 49201, Weaver versus Weaver. Petitioner is present. Respondent is present. The judge looked at Julia over his spectacles. "Mrs. Weaver, are you representing yourself today?" "I see no counsel on record for you." Julia stood up. "For the moment, Your Honor. My primary counsel had a flight delay coming in from out of town. He should be here shortly. I asked the court's indulgence for a few minutes." Sloane shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is a delay tactic. Mrs. Weaver has had weeks to secure counsel. If her lawyer isn't here, that is not the court's problem. We move to proceed with the settlement enforcement." "I agree," the judge sighed. "Mrs. Weaver, we can't hold up the docket. We will proceed. Mr. Sloane, your opening statement." Sloane smirked at Charles. This was a slaughter. "Your Honor," Sloane began, pacing the floor, his voice booming. "We are here to dissolve a marriage that has effectively been over for years. My client, Mr. Weaver, is a self-made visionary. He built Weaver Tech from the ground up. The respondent, Mrs. Weaver, has not been employed in 8 years. She has contributed 0 capital, 0 intellectual property, and 0 labor to the business." Sloane gestured dramatically at Julia. "She is now attempting to extort my client for a share of a company she has no right to. We have a prenuptial agreement, signed 10 years ago, which clearly states that any assets acquired during the marriage remain the sole property of the earner. We are offering a generous settlement purely out of Mr. Weaver's kindness. We ask the court to enforce the prenup and grant the divorce immediately." The judge nodded, looking bored. "Mrs. Weaver? Your response?" Julia stood up again. She looked small against the towering figure of Sloane. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear but quiet. "The prenup Mr. Sloane refers to was signed under duress 3 days before the wedding, without me having independent legal representation. Furthermore, the 0 capital claim is false. I provided the initial seed money of $40,000 in 2014. That money was not a gift. It was an investment." Charles laughed out loud. "Seed money? You paid the rent, Julia. That's not investing. That's being a wife." "Order," the judge snapped. Sloane chuckled, shaking his head. "Your Honor, paying domestic bills does not buy you equity in a tech giant. If Mrs. Weaver wants to claim she's an investor, where is the paperwork? Where is the stock certificate? She has nothing. She is a housewife who got lucky marrying a genius and now wants a golden parachute." He turned to Julia, his eyes cold and predatory. "Let's be honest, Mrs. Weaver. You don't have the resources to fight this. You don't have the evidence. And frankly, looking at you, you don't have the stomach for it. Why are you wasting the court's time?" It was a humiliating public dressing down. Charles watched with a smug grin. He loved seeing Sloane work. He was worth every penny of the $800 hourly rate. I have bank records," Julia stammered. Looking down at her hands, she looked defeated. "Bank records of buying groceries," Sloane mocked. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss her claims regarding the company assets." "Granted," the judge said, reaching for his stamp. "Unless you have something substantial, Mrs. Weaver, I'm inclined to rule with the petitioner." The courtroom doors banged open. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Everyone turned. Walking through the doors was a phalanx of 4 men in identical charcoal grey suits. They moved with a synchronized, predatory grace that made Sloane look like an amateur. At the front of the group was a man who looked to be in his 60s. He had silver hair, a beard trimmed to microscopic precision, and he carried a leather briefcase that looked like it had been passed down through 3 generations of monarchs. He didn't walk. He glided. The air in the room changed instantly. The smell of rain and floor polish was replaced by the scent of old money, sandalwood, expensive tobacco, and power. The man walked straight to Julia's table. He ignored Charles. He ignored Sloane. He placed his briefcase on the table, clicked it open, and turned to the judge. "Apologies for the tardiness, Your Honor," the man said. His voice was rich, with a clipped transatlantic accent that sounded like 1940s radio. "The weather in Zurich delayed our private jet, and traffic from SeaTac was beastly." Judge Holloway blinked, sitting up straighter. "And you are?" The man turned to face the room. He looked at Charles Weaver for the first time. The look wasn't angry. It was the way a human looks at an insect they are about to crush. "I am Arthur Blackwood," the man said. "Senior partner at Blackwood, Sterling and Rothschild." A gasp went through the courtroom. Even the stenographer stopped typing. Blackwood, Sterling and Rothschild wasn't a law firm you hired. It was a firm that managed the affairs of nations. They represented royalty, oil tycoons, and the quietest, oldest money in Europe. They didn't do divorces in Seattle. Charles frowned. "Who the hell is this?" he whispered to Sloane. Sloane was pale. He was staring at Blackwood like he was seeing a ghost. That's the Queen's personal counsel for U.S. affairs," Sloane whispered back, his voice trembling. "Charles, what did you do?" Arthur Blackwood adjusted his silk tie. "I am here to represent the respondent, Mrs. Madeline Julia Kensington Sterling." Charles froze. "Who?" Blackwood smiled, a cold, terrifying expression. "Oh, I apologize. You know her as Julia Weaver. But her legal name, the name on the trust funds, the real estate holdings in London, Monaco, and New York, and the name on the majority shareholder agreement of the venture capital firm that funded your Series B round, is Madeline Sterling." Blackwood turned to the judge. "Your Honor, we are not here to ask for a settlement. We are here to file a countersuit for fraud, embezzlement of marital assets, and to conduct a full audit of Weaver Technologies." Blackwood paused for effect. "A company which, according to our records, my client's family effectively owns." He turned to Charles, whose face had gone the color of ash. "Shall we begin?" The silence in courtroom 4B was absolute. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to have paused out of respect for the name that had just been spoken. Sterling. Charles Weaver blinked, the arrogance slowly draining from his face, replaced by a confused frown. He leaned toward his lawyer. "Sloane, what is he talking about? Her name is Julia. Her parents were school teachers in Ohio. I met them. They drove a Subaru." Garrick Sloane wasn't listening to his client. He was staring at the documents Arthur Blackwood had just placed on the judge's bench. Sloane knew the hierarchy of legal power. He was a shark in the Seattle pond. Blackwood, Sterling, and Rothschild were the leviathans that swam in the deep ocean. "Your Honor," Sloane said, his voice lacking its earlier boom, "this is preposterous. We have marriage certificates, tax returns. The respondent is Julia Weaver. This Sterling nonsense is a fabrication to confuse the proceedings." Arthur Blackwood didn't even look at Sloane. He simply opened a second leather folio. "Your Honor," Blackwood said, his tone bored, "my client was born Madeline Julia Kensington Sterling to protect her from fortune hunters." He paused, letting his eyes drift dismissively over Charles. She adopted her middle name and a modest lifestyle during her university years and subsequent young adulthood. Her parents, whom Mr. Weaver refers to, are indeed retired educators. They are also the caretakers of the Sterling philanthropic estates in Ohio. They are not poor, they are simply discreet, something Mr. Weaver clearly knows nothing about. Blackwood pulled a single thick document from his stack. Mr. Weaver mentioned a Series B funding round that valued his company at $40 million. He claimed my client contributed nothing to this success. Charles bristled, finding his voice. "She didn't. I pitched that round to Helix Capital in New York. I spent weeks negotiating with their board. Julia was at home watching cooking shows." Blackwood smiled. It was a small, tight expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Weaver, did you ever wonder why Helix Capital, a firm known for buying distressed shipping lanes and European real estate, suddenly took an interest in a mid-level Seattle tech startup?" Charles froze. He had wondered that, but the check had cleared and the validation stroked his ego, so he hadn't asked questions. "Helix Capital," Blackwood continued, "is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Kensington Family Trust, the sole beneficiary of which is my client, Mrs. Weaver." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. "You pitched your company to your wife's bank account, Mr. Weaver," Blackwood said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "And she approved the funding. Not because your pitch was brilliant, but because she believed in you. She has been bankrolling your ego for 5 years." "That's a lie!" Charles shouted, standing up. "I built this." "Me?" "Sit down, Mr. Weaver," Judge Holloway barked. The judge turned to Blackwood, his eyes wide. "Mr. Blackwood, do you have proof of this chain of ownership?" "I have the incorporation papers of Helix Capital, signed by the trustee, identifying Madeline Sterling as the primary shareholder. I also have the wire transfer receipts, the $5 million that saved Weaver Tech from bankruptcy in 2019. It came from her private trust." Blackwood turned to Sloane. "Now, regarding the prenuptial agreement you are so fond of, we are happy to enforce it." Sloane blinked. You are?" "Oh, certainly," Blackwood said. "The prenup states that all assets acquired prior to the marriage, or via inheritance or trust during the marriage, remain separate property. Since Weaver Tech was funded almost entirely by my client's separate trust property, we argue that the company is not a marital asset. It is a debt asset owed to the Sterling Trust. And since the loan terms from Helix Capital, which Mr. Weaver signed without reading the fine print, I assume, include a change of control clause in the event of executive misconduct." Blackwood closed his folder with a heavy thud. "We are here to call in the loan. In full. Immediately." Charles felt the room spin. "Call in the loan? I can't pay back $5 million plus interest. The cash is tied up in expansion. If you call the loan, the company goes insolvent." "Precisely," Blackwood said coldly. "Unless, of course, the majority shareholder steps in to restructure management. Which brings us to our motion, Your Honor. We move to freeze all assets of Weaver Technologies and Charles Weaver personal accounts, pending a forensic audit. We have reason to believe Mr. Weaver has been using company funds, my client's funds, to maintain a mistress." "Objection!" Sloane screamed, but it was weak. "This is speculation." "I have credit card statements," Blackwood said, producing yet another document. "Tiffany's, the Four Seasons Maui, a Porsche lease in the name of one Audrey Miller, all paid from the Weaver Tech operational expense account." The judge looked at the receipts. He looked at Charles, who was now sweating profusely. "Motion granted," Judge Holloway said, slamming the gavel. "All assets frozen. Temporary restraining order issued against Mr. Weaver regarding company finances. Mr. Sloane, I suggest you get your house in order. We reconvene in 48 hours. As the bailiff called, "All rise," Charles slumped in his chair. He looked at Julia. She was standing, gathering her things. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Julia," Charles rasped, "you can't do this. You're destroying my life." Julia paused. She looked at Arthur Blackwood, then back at Charles. "I'm not Julia," she said softly. "And it's not your life, Charles. It never was. It was a rental." She turned and walked out, the 4 grey-suited men forming a protective wall around her. The lobby of Weaver Technologies was usually a temple of hushed productivity. Today, it was a chaotic scene of panic. It was 9 a.m. the morning after the hearing. Charles Weaver stormed through the glass doors, his face flushed. His keycard didn't work. "What is this?" he shouted, slamming his badge against the reader. "Open the damn door!" The security guard, a man named Mike, whom Charles had ignored for 6 years, looked up from his console. He looked uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, Mr. Weaver. My access codes have been overridden. We have visitors." "Visitors? It's my company." The glass doors slid open, but not for Charles. A team of 12 people in severe black suits marched out of the elevators. They carried bankers' boxes and laptops. They weren't police. They were terrifyingly efficient private auditors. At the center of the lobby, near the reception desk where Audrey Miller usually held court, stood a woman. It took Charles a second to recognize her. It was Julia. But it wasn't the wife, he knew. She wore a cream-colored power suit that screamed haute couture, Chanel, perhaps, or something even more exclusive. Her hair was down, cascading over her shoulders in waves. She wore sunglasses. Standing next to her was Arthur Blackwood, and a shorter, severe-looking woman with a tablet. Charles pushed past the security turnstile, jumping over the barrier. "Julia, what the hell is going on? Why is my badge deactivated?" The music in the lobby seemed to stop. Employees were peering over the balconies from the second and third floors, whispering. Julia took off her sunglasses. She looked at Charles with a detachment that chilled his blood. "We are conducting an emergency audit, Charles," she said. Her voice carried through the silent lobby. "As the representative of the majority debt holder, Helix Capital, I have authorized a suspension of the CEO's powers pending an investigation into embezzlement." "Embezzlement?" Charles laughed, a manic, high-pitched sound. "Spending company money on dinners isn't embezzlement. I own the place." "You own 40% of the equity," the severe woman with the tablet cut in. "Helix Capital holds a convertible note that, upon default, which occurred at 8 a.m. this morning, when we called the loan and you failed to pay, converted into 51% controlling equity. You are a minority shareholder, Mr. Weaver, and you are currently trespassing." "Trespassing?" Charles spluttered. He looked around for support. He saw Audrey standing near the copier room, looking terrified. She was holding a box of personal items. "Audrey!" Charles yelled. "Call Sloan. Tell him to get down here." Audrey shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I can't, Charles. They said—" She pointed a trembling finger at the auditors. "They said I have to return the car, and the jewelry. They said it's company property." Charles turned back to Julia. "You're taking her car? You're that petty?" "It's not pettiness, Charles," Julia said, stepping closer. "It's fiduciary duty. That Porsche was purchased with funds allocated for server maintenance. That is fraud. If I don't recover the assets, the IRS will." She signaled to the security guard. "Mike, please escort Mr. Weaver to his office so he can collect his personal effects. Only personal effects. No laptops, no hard drives, no documents. If he tries to take a stapler that belongs to the company, document it." "Yes. Ms. Sterling," Mike said, standing taller than he ever had. "You can't do this!" Charles screamed as Mike took his arm. "I am the visionary. I wrote the code. The platform is nothing without me." Julia looked at him, a flicker of pity crossing her face. "The code was rewritten 2 years ago by your lead engineer, David," she said. "You haven't pushed a commit in 18 months. You've been too busy being a visionary at lunch with Audrey." She turned to the gathered employees on the balcony. "Everyone, please return to your desks," she announced, her voice calm and authoritative. "Your jobs are safe. Payroll will be met this Friday, fully funded by the Sterling Trust. There will be some management changes, but the company is stable." A ripple of relief went through the staff. They didn't care about Charles. They cared about their paychecks. Charles was dragged toward the elevators, kicking and shouting threats about suing everyone. As the elevator doors closed on his screaming face, Julia let out a long breath. Her shoulders slumped slightly. Arthur Blackwood stepped up beside her. "You handled that perfectly, Madeline. The grandmother would be proud." "I don't want her to be proud, Arthur," Julia said, putting her sunglasses back on to hide the moisture in her eyes. I just want it to be over." "It's not over yet," Blackwood warned. "Charles is a narcissist. He won't go quietly. He'll try the media next. He'll try to paint you as the vindictive heiress crushing the self-made man." "Let him try," Julia said, turning toward the conference room. "He forgot one thing." "What's that?" "I know all his passwords." 3 days after being escorted out of his own building, Charles Weaver sat in the makeup chair of CNB Global, the city's most-watched business news network. He looked haggard, but it was a curated exhaustion. His suit was slightly rumpled, a calculated choice by his new PR crisis manager, a woman named Val who cost more per hour than his lawyer. "Remember," Val whispered, leaning in as the makeup artist dusted powder on Charles's forehead, "you are the victim. You are the hard-working American dreamer. She is the shadowy elite. She lied to you. She trapped you. Use the word deception as much as possible." Charles nodded. He was good at this. He was a salesman, after all. The studio lights flared. The anchor, a sharp-eyed man named Rick Tanson, counted down. "We are live in 3, 2. Tonight on Market Watch," Tanson began. "A tech darling in free fall. Charles Weaver, founder of Weaver Technologies, was ousted this week in a hostile takeover led by his own wife. But new allegations suggest this wasn't just a divorce dispute. It was a corporate coup." Tanson turned to Charles. "Charles, thanks for coming on. Walk us through what happened." Charles leaned forward, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Rick, I'm still in shock. You think you know someone. I was married to Julia for 10 years. We lived in a 2-bedroom condo. We clipped coupons. I thought we were building a life together." He paused, looking down. "I didn't know I was sleeping next to a stranger. I didn't know she was Madeline Sterling, the heiress to an empire worth billions. She lied to me every single day of our marriage. She watched me work 18-hour days, watched me stress about payroll, all while sitting on a fortune that could have solved everything with a snap of her fingers. And now that the company is worth millions, she decides to reveal herself and steal it. She claims the company was funded by her trust," Tanson pressed. "Paper tricks," Charles scoffed, regaining his fire. "Complex shell companies I knew nothing about. She set me up, Rick. It was a long con. She let me build the value, and now she's using her family's high-priced lawyers to hijack my life's work. It's not just a divorce. It's a hostile takeover by the 1% against a guy who started in a garage. The narrative was perfect. Within minutes, social media was ablaze. Justice for Charles began trending. Imagine finding out your wife is a secret billionaire and she steals your job. That's evil, one user tweeted. Eat the rich, another posted, sharing Charles's clip. Julia watched the broadcast from the penthouse suite of the Fairmont Olympic Hotel, which the Sterling family had rented out in its entirety. She turned off the TV. Her hands were shaking. "He's winning. The public hates me. They think I'm a monster." Arthur Blackwood sat in an armchair by the fire, calmly sipping a brandy. He didn't look worried. He looked bored. "Public opinion is like the wind, Madeline," Blackwood said. "It blows hard, but it changes direction the moment the weather shifts. Charles is playing a checkers game. He thinks this is about sympathy." "It feels like it's working," Julia said, pacing the room. "The board members are calling. They're nervous about the bad press." "Let them be nervous," a voice said from the doorway. Julia froze. She turned around. Standing there, leaning on an ebony cane topped with a silver hawk, was an elderly woman. She was small, perhaps only 5 feet tall, but she cast a shadow that seemed to fill the room. She wore a simple tweed suit that probably cost more than Charles's entire wardrobe, and her white hair was coiffed into an immovable helmet of authority. It was Lady Victoria Sterling, the matriarch. "Grandmother," Julia breathed. I didn't know you flew in." "I do not fly, Madeline," Lady Victoria said, walking into the room. "I arrive, and I certainly do not let a Sterling fight a war alone, especially against a man who wears polyester blends." She sat on the sofa, gesturing for Julia to sit beside her. Lady Victoria's eyes were sharp, blue, and utterly ruthless. "You are weeping over a television interview," Lady Victoria observed, her voice dry. "Why?" "Because he's lying," Julia said. "He's making me look like a predator." "You are a predator, darling," Lady Victoria said, patting her hand. "You are a Sterling. We do not graze. We hunt. But we only hunt those who threaten the pack. This boy, this Charles, he has mistaken our silence for weakness. He thinks because we are private, we are afraid of the light." Lady Victoria turned to Blackwood. "Arthur, the file." Blackwood opened his briefcase and pulled out a black USB drive. "Ready when you are, madam." Lady Victoria looked at Julia. "We gave him a chance to walk away with dignity. We offered a settlement. He spat on it. Then we offered him a quiet exit from the company. He went to the press. He has chosen total war." "What is on the drive?" Julia asked. "The truth," Lady Victoria said. "Charles didn't just neglect his duties, Madeline. He was desperate to keep up appearances with his mistress. He needed cash, fast cash, more than his salary provided." She nodded to Blackwood. 2 years ago, Blackwood explained, Charles initiated a data partnership with a company called Veridex. On paper, it was market research. In reality, he was selling the private geolocation data of Weaver Tech users, unencrypted, illegal, and highly profitable for him personally. He routed the kickbacks to an offshore account in the Caymans. Julia gasped. That's a federal crime. If that gets out, the company is finished. The FTC will shut us down." "Not if we self-report," Lady Victoria corrected. "We sacrifice the stock price temporarily to excise the cancer. We frame it as the Sterling cleanup. We reveal that the new management, you, discovered the fraud and are acting to protect the users. Charles becomes not just a bad husband, but a criminal." "But he'll go to prison," Julia whispered. Lady Victoria looked at her granddaughter. The softness was gone. "He betrayed you. He humiliated you. And now he tries to destroy our family name on national television. Prison is a kindness compared to what I could do to him." She stood up. "Release the file, Arthur. Give it to the Wall Street Journal, and send a copy to the district attorney." She looked back at Julia. "Dry your eyes, Madeline. The interview is over. The trial is about to begin." The morning after the interview, Charles woke up feeling like a king. His inbox was full of supportive emails. A literary agent had already reached out about a book deal. The Billionaire's Ghost, My Life with a Stranger. He whistled as he made coffee in the condo he was currently renting, since he was barred from the house. He turned on the TV, expecting to see replays of his interview. Instead, he saw a breaking news banner. Breaking news. FBI raids home of Weaver Tech founder. Charles dropped his mug. It shattered, hot coffee splashing over his bare feet. "What?" he whispered. The screen showed footage, shaky, helicopter footage, of federal agents carrying boxes out of his Belltown condo. His condo. The anchor was speaking rapidly. Shocking developments in the Weaver Tech saga today. The Wall Street Journal has released a bombshell report alleging that former CEO Charles Weaver was personally involved in the illegal sale of user data to foreign brokers. Documents released by the company's new board indicate a massive scheme to defraud users. Charles scrambled for his phone. It was buzzing. It was Garrick Sloane. "Don't say a word," Sloane shouted, before Charles could speak. "Don't tweet. Don't answer the door. I am dropping you as a client." "What?" Charles screamed. "You can't drop me. I need you. I am a divorce lawyer, Charles. I don't do federal indictments, and I certainly don't represent clients who pay me with laundered money. The feds are already asking about my retainer. You are on your own." The line went dead. A loud banging on the door made Charles jump. "FBI, open up!" Charles ran to the window. Down on the street, news vans were swarming. The narrative had flipped in an instant. Yesterday, he was the victim. Today, he was the villain who sold people's privacy to buy his mistress a Porsche. He opened the door. He didn't have a choice. 6 hours later, Charles sat in an interrogation room. He had been processed, fingerprinted, and stripped of his suit. He wore an orange jumpsuit that smelled of bleach. The door opened. He expected a federal agent. Instead, Arthur Blackwood walked in. The lawyer looked impeccable, as always. He carried a single sheet of paper. "You're not my lawyer," Charles spat. "Get out." "I am not here as your lawyer," Blackwood said, sitting down. "I am here as a messenger from the Sterling family." "They did this," Charles hissed. "She did this." "You did this, Charles," Blackwood said calmly. "You sold the data. You signed the wire transfers. We simply turned on the lights." Blackwood slid the paper across the table. "The district attorney is building a RICO case. They are talking about 20 years. Federal prison. No golf. No Audreys." Charles felt the bile rise in his throat. 20 years. "However," Blackwood continued, "the family prefers privacy. A long, public trial is distasteful to Lady Victoria. It keeps the Sterling name in the papers for too long." "So?" Charles asked, his voice trembling. "So we have a proposal. You will plead guilty to a lesser charge of gross negligence. You will admit publicly that you lied about Julia, Madeline, and that she had no knowledge of your schemes. You will sign over your remaining 40% equity in Weaver Tech to the Sterling Trust for the sum of $1. $1? Charles stared at him. "That stock is worth millions. It is worth nothing if you are in prison for 20 years and the company collapses from the scandal," Blackwood countered. "If you sign, we will provide the evidence that proves your negligence was not malicious intent. The sentence will be reduced. 2 years. Minimum security. Maybe out in 18 months with good behavior." Charles looked at the paper. It was a plea deal, a surrender. "And if I don't sign?" Blackwood stood up and buttoned his jacket. "Then we give the DOJ the emails where you explicitly discuss hiding the money from the IRS. That moves the charge from negligence to tax evasion and money laundering. You'll die in prison, Charles." Charles looked at the metal table. He thought about the interview yesterday. He thought about the book deal. He thought about the Porsche. It was all smoke. It was all gone. He picked up the pen. His hand shook so violently he could barely hold it. Does she know?" Charles asked quietly. "Julia?" "Madeline," Blackwood corrected. "And no, she's busy. She is taking the company public in London next week. She has moved on." Charles signed the paper. Blackwood took it, checked the signature, and placed it in his pocket. "A wise choice, Mr. Weaver. Enjoy your stay." Blackwood tapped on the door. The guard opened it. As Blackwood walked out, Charles shouted, "Tell her I'm sorry!" Blackwood didn't look back. The heavy steel door slammed shut, sealing Charles in the silence he had created for himself. 18 months had passed since the rain in Seattle had felt like a cage, trapping Madeline in a life of beige walls and silent indignities. Now, the rain falling over London felt entirely different. It didn't weep. It drummed a rhythm of conquest against the reinforced glass of the penthouse suite at the newly christened Stirling Tower. From 50 stories up, the city lights of London smeared into a kaleidoscope of gold and obsidian, a sprawling kingdom that now recognized her as one of its sovereigns. Madeline Stirling stood alone by the floor-to-ceiling window, her silhouette framed against the storm outside. She held a crystal flute of vintage Krug, the bubbles rising in a steady, golden stream. She was no longer the woman who checked price tags at the grocery store or apologized for existing in her husband's hallway. Tonight, she wore a gown of emerald green silk that draped over her body like liquid armor, tailored to perfection by a couturier who didn't ask for her name because he already knew it. Her hair, once pulled back in a severe, invisible bun to avoid drawing attention, now cascaded in loose, deliberate waves over her shoulders. Behind her, the expansive reception room hummed with the specific, low-frequency vibration of immense wealth. It was not the raucous, desperate energy of the tech parties Charles used to drag her to, parties where people shouted over thumping bass to prove they were relevant. This was the quiet, confident murmur of the global elite. These were people who moved markets with a whisper. There were banking magnates from Zurich, shipping tycoons from Hong Kong, and the quiet, old-money families of Europe who had survived revolutions and wars without losing a cent. And they were all here for her. Arthur Blackwood materialized at her elbow. He moved with the same predatory grace he had displayed in the Seattle courtroom, though tonight his face was softer, lined with the satisfaction of a job well done. He held a leather folio, not a legal brief this time, but a closing report. "A triumph, Madeline," Arthur said, his voice barely rising above the ambient chatter, yet cutting through it perfectly. The final numbers from the London Stock Exchange just came in. The IPO was oversubscribed by 200%. The market didn't just welcome sterling tech, it devoured it. Madeline took a slow sip of the champagne, the cold, dry taste grounding her. It wasn't the algorithm they bought, Arthur. It was the promise of privacy, Arthur agreed, nodding. A novel concept in this day and age. "We simply gave them what Charles never could," Madeline said, turning slightly to look at the room. "Integrity. We purged every line of code that siphoned user data. We burned the bridges to the data brokers. We told the world that their secrets were safe with us. It turns out, people are willing to pay a premium for dignity." "Who knew?" "Indeed," Arthur murmured. "The Sterling Shield encryption protocol is already being hailed as the new gold standard for corporate security. The cleanup is complete. The company is clean. The name is clean." He paused then, a hesitation that was uncharacteristic for a man who made his living by being direct. Madeline sensed the shift in his demeanor immediately. She turned fully to face him, her grey eyes sharp. "You have news of him," she stated. It wasn't a question. Arthur sighed, adjusting his silk tie. "I do. I debated whether to bring it to you tonight, of all nights, but I know you prefer the ledger to be balanced." "Tell me," Madeline said. Her heart rate didn't spike. Her palms didn't sweat. The terror she used to feel when Charles raised his voice was a distant memory, like a nightmare from a childhood she had outgrown. "Charles was released from federal custody yesterday morning," Arthur said quietly. "Due to the plea deal and his exemplary behavior, he served 18 months of the 2-year sentence. He has been transferred to a halfway house in Spokane." "Spokane," Madeline repeated the word, testing the weight of it. It was far away. It was irrelevant. He is required to maintain employment as part of his parole, Arthur continued, a hint of dry amusement colouring his tone. It seems the visionary found the job market somewhat inhospitable to convicted felons with a history of fraud. He is currently employed at a car wash on the outskirts of the city. He wipes down hubcaps. Madeline looked back out at the London skyline. She tried to conjure up an image of Charles Weaver, the man who had stood in his glass office and told her she was worth nothing, now standing in the cold, scrubbing mud off the tires of sedans that were cheaper than the suits he used to wear. She waited for the rush of vindication, the hot flare of triumph that she had imagined 1,000 times during the divorce. She waited to feel the urge to laugh, to gloat, to send him a postcard. But there was nothing. No anger, no pity. Just a vast, cool indifference. He was a ghost, a minor character in the first chapter of a book she was no longer writing. "I hope he finds peace," Madeline said, and she was surprised to find that she meant it. He always wanted to be a man of the people, didn't he? Now he has a simple life. No investors, no lies, no pressure to be a genius. In a way, Arthur, I think we gave him his freedom. Arthur chuckled, a low, rasping sound. "You are more gracious than I, Madeline. I admit I find the image of him with a soapy sponge quite poetic." "It's not grace, Arthur," she corrected him gently. "It's indifference. Hate requires energy. I have none left to spare for him." Across the vast room, the crowd seemed to part. Sitting on a velvet divan near the fireplace, holding court like a queen on her throne, was Lady Victoria Sterling. The matriarch looked frail, her skin like parchment, but her eyes were as blue and fierce as a gas flame. She was listening to a young earl describe his estate, but her gaze was fixed across the room, locked onto Madeline. For the first time in Madeline's life, there was no criticism in that gaze. There was no assessment of her posture, no critique of her choices. Lady Victoria lifted her cane an inch off the floor and gave a single, sharp nod. It was a salute. It was an acknowledgement that the torch had been passed, not because of bloodline, but because of blood spilled and battles won. Madeline felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the champagne. She had spent a decade trying to be a good wife, then a year trying to be a good litigant. Tonight, she was simply herself. She handed her empty glass to a passing waiter and walked to the center of the room. The movement rippled through the crowd. Conversations died out mid-sentence. Heads turned. The ambient music seemed to fade into the background. By the time Madeline reached the center of the Persian rug, the room was silent. She didn't need a microphone. She had found her voice in a courtroom in Seattle, and she had honed it in the boardrooms of London. "Thank you all for being here," she began. Her voice was calm, resonant, filling the space without effort. 18 months ago, I stood in a room much smaller than this one, and I was told that I was powerless. I was told that my value was zero. I was told that because I was quiet, I was weak. I was told that because I was a wife, I could not be a warrior. She let her gaze drift over the faces in the room, the sharks, the lions, the titans of industry. They were listening to her with a reverence they usually reserved for ticker tape numbers. "I stand here tonight to tell you that the people who underestimate silence do so at their own peril," Madeline continued. "We often mistake noise for power. We think the person shouting the loudest is the one in control. But I learned that power isn't a title. It isn't a corner office. And it certainly isn't the ability to bully those around you." She paused, looking toward Arthur, then to Lady Victoria, and finally, directly into the eyes of the young women in the room who were watching her with awe. "Power is knowing exactly who you are when the world is trying to strip you of your name. power is the patience to wait for the right moment to strike, and power is the ability to rebuild a legacy from the ashes of a betrayal. Madeline raised a fresh glass that Arthur had slipped into her hand. So, tonight, I do not drink to the stock price. I do not drink to sterling tech. I propose a toast to the unseen, to the overlooked, to the quiet ones who are listening, watching, and waiting. She smiled, an expression that was both terrifying and beautiful. May they never be underestimated again. To the quiet ones! The room roared back in unison, a chorus of voices that shook the crystal chandeliers. Madeline drank. The champagne was sweet, but the victory was sweeter. Outside, the storm raged on, battering the glass. But inside, Madeline Sterling was the eye of the hurricane, calm, untouchable, and finally, undeniably, free. And that is how the ghost wife dismantled a tyrant without ever raising her voice. Charles Weaver spent a decade thinking he was the main character, never realizing he was just the villain in Madeline's origin story. He mistook her silence for submission, not realizing that while he was playing checkers, she was mastering the art of war. In the end, the woman he called Powerless didn't just take his company, she took his dignity, and she did it all while wearing the family pearls. If this story of cold, calculated revenge gave you chills, or if you just love seeing a narcissist get exactly what he deserves, do me a huge favor and smash that like button. It helps the algorithm find more people who need to hear this. And if you're not part of the family yet, hit subscribe and turn on that notification bell. Next week, we're diving into a story about a billionaire who left his fortune to his cat, and the butler who knew too much. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching, and remember, never underestimate the quiet ones.